Good morning. It's a wonderful Lord's Day. It's a wonderful opportunity. Have all of you, welcome all of you, especially our visitors. I'd like you to know how much we appreciate you. We try to say so. We try to show it and hope that we do. Sometimes things get lost in the shadows. The fact that a thing gets lost in the shadows doesn't mean that the thing itself does not exist. It does. It's just simply that we don't see it for whatever reason. Our vision of it or our appreciation of it is lost because it's overpowered by something. And I'm borrowing this morning from the image of a larger shadow that sometimes covers over little things that really in themselves are not little. It's just that we don't see them for whatever reason. As large and important as they may be, that doesn't mean that they're small. It's just that in terms of our seeing them, we miss them, and quite often that's to our detriment when we do. That's the case with certain passages of Scripture. There are certain passages wherein we take an overpowering view sometimes of something, and that something becomes the shadow that pretty much engulfs our attention, and somewhere down toward the ground there's a truth that for whatever reason we miss and we don't see it. And hopefully as we live, the longer we live, the more we study, the more we learn, those things will become apparent to us. And it's my prayer that they will become more and more important to us. And that the shadow that occupies our thinking quite often, even though it may be important, it serves to overshadow a greater truth. I want us to notice a few passages this morning that I think fall into that category that I've just described to you. And one of them is in Luke 23, verses 39 through 43, and it involves, of course, the thief on the cross. And if you will, with your own Bible this morning, follow along with me. Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Assuredly I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise." Now, when I mentioned the thief on the cross to you, what is it that typically comes to your mind? What's the first thing that you will think about, generally speaking? Well, that first thing is the necessity of baptism. That's what comes up. And the thief on the cross then becomes the focal point for a debate on whether or not baptism is necessary or essential for the forgiveness of sins. Now, I realize and I understand perfectly well that we have countless other passages, I say countless, many other passages that address that particular issue, and that's understood, and I'll leave it there. But my focus here is simply on the thief that's hanging on that cross, and my contention that there is an overshadowing way in which we treat this passage quite often. And that is, we study it and it immediately leads into a debate as to whether immersion is essential to forgiveness or whether it isn't. Now, I ask you the question. As strong as that shadow is, do you think that is what Luke, the writer, intended for us to see in recording this event? Somehow or another, I miss it here. So, if I have looked at this passage for many years, and in my mind's eye, then there's a shadow here. And I'm not saying the shadow is not important. Don't misunderstand me. But here's a shadow, and I fail to see it in connection with what Luke writes here as having any bearing on what I really need to see from the thief on the cross. Is there an overshadowed truth here that I need to find? And I suggest to you that there is. And the overshadowed truth really is dealt with by the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 5 in verses 8 through 10. And here, Paul doesn't even mention the thief, but he mentions those like the thief, and he includes us. And before I even notice with you Romans 5, 8 through 10, please understand, thief on the cross engaged Jesus in a conversation while in the midst of being executed. And Jesus was very nice to him. And the thief had a sudden change of heart. And he engaged the Lord in a very serious conversation. And Jesus told him, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." And I'm looking at this thief and I think, he's the last person in the world that deserves something like that. He doesn't deserve it. So I come to Romans 5 and I start with verse 8. But God demonstrates His own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than, having now been justified by His blood, we shall be saved from wrath through Him. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of His Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by His life. So here is the overshadowed truth of the thief on the cross. And that is, God loved us when we didn't deserve it. And that He still loves us when we don't deserve it. This thief didn't deserve it. But Jesus demonstrated His love toward him. That's the overshadowed truth. And if it teaches me anything, which it does, then it teaches me how to relate to people who are lost. People who are mean and ugly-spirited and don't deserve it. Understand that they have souls. How do you react and treat the lost? That's what Jesus teaches me here. So I see something of an overshadowed truth in all of this. Something that I maybe have missed over the years. But there it is. It's not something that requires a PhD degree to see. Very simple. And when this thief confesses, the way that he does here in verse 41, how often do you hear of a confession like that from anybody who says, you know what? We're here because we deserve it. This man's done nothing wrong. You won't often hear a straightforward confession like that from anybody. And to me, it's kind of interesting that we find that here. And I'm not saying, I'm just simply saying, here's an overshadowed truth that God loves those who are not deserving, and I'm not deserving either. All right, let's look at a second one here. And the second one, or second passage I used as our reading this morning. And that's in John 2, of course. And it's the occasion when at a wedding, Jesus turned water into wine. Now, when you read this passage, or when you hear it mentioned, or whatever, or taught, or whatever, what is the first thing that generally comes to your attention when you consider John 2, 1 through 11? The first thing that comes to your attention is, well, we want to know what the nature of this wine was. We want to know whether it was fermented or not. And we want to see how this factors into the debate on whether or not you should drink alcohol. And I understand the importance of all of that. Please understand, I do. I understand it. But then again, I have to ask myself the question, is that what John, as the writer, intended for me to see in this? What did John want me to see when he recorded this event? And I come back to it with the realization that John, when he wrote and recorded the things that he did so with one purpose in mind. And that one purpose is in John 20, 30 and 31. Many other signs did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe. And that by believing, you might have life through his name. So there's the sole purpose in John recording anything that he wrote. So when I come here to John 2, 1 through 11, and Jesus turns water into wine, and my focus then is on whether or not that wine is alcoholic. Well, that's an important thing, but that's not the thing that John wrote for me to see. So there's something that's being overshadowed here by something else. So what is the overshadowed truth that comes out of this passage here in John 2, 1 to 11? And when we come down to verse 11, then the overshadowed truth presents itself here at verse 11. This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. Pause for a moment. This is the first miracle or sign that Jesus performed in Cana of Galilee. Is there an overshadowed truth here that I need to appreciate? Well, verse 11, not only was this the beginning of signs that he did in Cana of Galilee, it manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So the disciples didn't walk away from this event arguing whether or not the grape juice was fermented or not. They walked away from this having witnessed the glory of Jesus, and they believed in him. In other words, their faith was validated by what they saw. And for me, that's the overshadowed truth in all of this. And how that impacts me is to ask the question, do I believe that Jesus turned water into wine? Or do I believe all the liberals out there that think this and think that in every conceivable way that he really didn't do that? They just thought he did. Do I believe that Jesus turned water into wine? That's the point. And if I don't, then I have a hard time explaining my unbelief. But if I do, then I'm on plane here or on page with these disciples who witnessed all of this, and they saw his glory, and they believed in him. That's the overshadowing or overshadowed truth of this passage. Now, there were a lot of people present when Jesus performed this miracle. And interestingly enough, John does not mention that these other people, the attendants, and these other folks that were present there at the wedding and all of that, he doesn't say that they saw his glory. He says the disciples saw his glory. And they believed. Well, so his glory was hidden to the others, but it was seen by them. They saw the overshadowed truth of the glory of Christ, and they believe. Now, do I believe? That's the point. Do I take this as John intended it to be taken, as evidence and proof that Jesus is who he says he is? That he is, in fact, the Son of God? Is that how it impacts me? That's the overshadowed truth. And I have to admit to you, in all the years that I've been teaching this passage, somehow or another, I think I have missed that somehow. I don't know how. But it's been an overshadowed truth all these years, and there it is. That's what I need to learn from it. Now, the debate over alcohol and use and all that, that's going to continue, and it'll always. But here's the overshadowed truth that I need to see. Now, there's one more. And for this one, we need to go to 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3. And let's pick up at verse 18 here. 1 Peter 3:18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, by whom he also went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. Now really, we could read this on down to the end of the chapter, but I confine my thoughts to verses 18 through 20. And What's the first thing when you read this passage that you think about, that comes to your mind, that you've always heard discussed? Anytime this passage is ever considered. Well, the question is, how did Jesus preach to those in the days of Noah? How did he do that? Why did he do that? But the real cliffhanger here is, how in the world could he have done that? Or how? We don't understand it. And we dig deeply into it. And we spend so much time and focus there. That's the focus of this passage for us. It always has been. And we'll try to figure that out till the day we die. And we may never reach the point of being satisfied as to how Jesus preached to the antediluvians through Noah. How did he do that? I don't know. But there's an overshadowed truth here that I need to see. An overshadowed truth. And that truth is in verse 20. And it's when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was in preparation. So, during the days of Noah, prior to the flood, here's the long suffering of God. And if you'll remember, Genesis 5 tells us that these people back then were so wicked, so evil, that every thought of the imagination of their heart was only evil continually. And yet, these are the people that Peter speaks of and says, well, you know, God was patient with those people back then. The long suffering of God. He didn't just, in a knee-jerk reaction, destroy these people. He gave them a chance. And through Noah's busy preaching to them, giving them the opportunity. Now, here's the overshadowed truth that I miss. And it's the long suffering of God. That's it. That's it. That if God was patient and long suffering with those people back then I can take heart that God is patient with people now. And He's patient with me. And that, you know, it's not hopeless. So, an overshadowed truth. And there it is. And I read it again in verse 20, and somehow or another, I don't guess it made an impression on me. I don't know why. But isn't that the way it is with overshadowed truths? Those truths that are somehow hidden in the shadows. That doesn't mean they aren't there. It only means that in my blindness, I've missed it somehow or another. So overshadowed truths, and the overshadowed truths quite often are the most obvious truths of all. They're as big as daylight. And I see them now. And I'm not revealing to you anything that you don't know already. But here they are. From the thief on the cross. It's the fact of God's love for the undeserving. From Jesus turning water into wine, it's the fact that He demonstrated by signs His claim to be the Son of God. He proved it. Do I believe it? And here, when He preached through Noah to the spirits in prison, how in the world did He do that? I don't know. But I take away from it that God is long-suffering and God is a patient God. And I'm grateful for that. because I need it. So do you. So here are 3 overshadowed truths, we might call them. I hope they make an impression on you. I hope the thief on the cross suggests to you, you might be in a lost condition. I hope, number 2, that Jesus turning the water into wine might suggest to you, well, the disciples believed him. If I believe him, then that suggests more than just believe that I might need to obey him. And then in 1 Peter 3, you read a little bit further and you see how Peter took that incident that we just read down to verse 20, and you follow it down to the end of the chapter. And Peter said, the antitype to all this is that baptism now saves us. Not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God. And that brings it down to you this morning, whether or not you need to obey the gospel. And if you do, we urge you while we stand and sing this song.
It's the grandest theme that the world e'er sung. Our God is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver thee.